Today we're going over the most devastating political trap in recorded history. A man inherits an empire at its absolute peak. He commands a population of roughly 6 million people. His capital city is bigger than London or Paris at the time, built on an island in the middle of a lake, connected to the mainland by causeways that can be flooded in an instant to stop any invading army in its tracks. He has tens of thousands of warriors at his immediate disposal. And in less than 2 years, he loses everything. His throne, his freedom, his dignity, and eventually his life, to a foreign force of barely 500 men who arrive on his shores with no reinforcements, no resupply line, and no real understanding of the land they've just walked into. He wasn't defeated in open battle. He wasn't betrayed by some single dramatic act of treachery. He was undone, piece by piece, by his own hospitality, his own religion, his own subjects, and finally by the very strangers he had welcomed into his home. His name was Montezuma, the 9th emperor of the Aztecs, and this is the story of how the most powerful man in the Americas became a hostage in his own palace. Setup: the empire at its peak. To understand how staggering Montezuma's fall actually was, you need to understand what he was ruling over before any of this started. Montezuma, more accurately rendered as Moctezuma, though history mostly remembers the Spanish version of his name, becomes the 9th emperor of the Aztec Empire in 1502. By this point, the Aztecs, or the Mexica as they called themselves, had spent nearly a century building one of the most sophisticated and powerful states in the Western Hemisphere. The empire is technically a triple alliance, 3 city-states, Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, and Tlacopan, bound together since 1428, but by Montezuma's reign, everyone understands which member of that alliance is actually in charge. Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, dominates the partnership completely, and Tenochtitlan itself defies easy description. Built on an island in Lake Texcoco, home to roughly 200,000 people, it features causeways, canals, floating gardens called chinampas that let the Aztecs grow food on artificial islands, towering temple pyramids, and a level of urban planning that genuinely rivals or exceeds most European cities of the same era. When Spanish soldiers eventually lay eyes on it, several of them would later write that it looked like something out of a fantasy novel. They struggled to believe a real place could look like that. Under Montezuma's rule, the empire expands to its greatest territorial extent in its entire history, pushing as far south as the Isthmus of Tehuantepec and incorporating new peoples like the Zapotec and the Yopi into its tribute system. That tribute system is the actual engine of the empire's power. Hundreds of subjugated city-states across central Mexico are required to send goods, labor, and, critically, captives to Tenochtitlan, partly as tax, partly as material for the religious sacrifices the Aztec state religion demands on a regular basis. This system works extraordinarily well at generating wealth and centralizing power. It also generates something else: an empire absolutely full of people who deeply, quietly resent Tenochtitlan, and who are simply waiting for the right moment and the right ally to do something about it. Montezuma doesn't know it yet, but that ally is already crossing the ocean. The strangers arrive in 1519. A Spanish expedition lands on the Gulf Coast of Mexico under the command of a minor noble named Hernán Cortés. Cortés arrives with roughly 500 soldiers, 100 or so sailors, and, critically and decisively, horses, steel weapons, and firearms, none of which exist anywhere in the Americas at this point in history. He's also, technically, acting outside his actual authority. The governor of Cuba who originally backed this expedition tries to recall him partway through, and Cortés simply ignores the order. As he moves inland, Cortés starts doing something that turns out to be far more dangerous to the Aztec Empire than any weapon he's carrying. He starts listening. He learns, through a remarkable woman named Malintzin, given to him as a slave, fluent in both Nahuatl and Mayan, who quickly becomes indispensable as an interpreter and advisor, that the Aztec Empire is not some unified, beloved nation. It is a tribute empire sitting on top of dozens of subjugated, resentful populations. The most important of these is Tlaxcala, a powerful state that has fought the Aztecs for decades and never been fully conquered, in part because subjugating Tlaxcala would deprive the Aztecs of a convenient nearby source of sacrificial captives. Cortés meets the Tlaxcalans, recognizes immediately what he's looking at, and makes them his allies against their hated rivals. This is the part of the story that doesn't get told nearly often enough. The fall of the Aztec Empire isn't simply Spain conquers Mexico. It's a Spanish captain inserting himself into the middle of an existing Mesoamerican civil war, on the side that actually wants Tenochtitlan gone. Word of these strange newcomers, pale men, riding animals nobody has ever seen, carrying weapons that produce thunder and smoke, reaches Montezuma's court long before Cortés himself does. The prophecy problem. Here's where we need to be careful, because this part of the story has been simplified and mythologized for 5 centuries, mostly by the people who benefited from telling it that way. The popular version goes like this. 1519 happened to fall on a one-reed year in the Aztec calendar, a year associated with the god Quetzalcoatl, who legend said would one day return from the east. Montezuma, the story goes, became so paralyzed by the belief that Cortés might actually be this returning god that he simply froze, unable to resist, sealing his own doom through religious terror. It's a compelling story. Modern historians increasingly believe it's also largely a retroactive narrative, one shaped heavily by Spanish writers eager to portray the conquest as something closer to divine destiny than what it actually was. A messy, opportunistic military and political campaign. What we can say with more confidence is this: Montezuma was uncertain. He didn't know exactly what these strangers were, what they wanted, or what they were capable of. And uncertainty, when you're the absolute ruler of an empire built on the appearance of total control, is its own kind of crisis. So Montezuma does what any sophisticated ruler facing an unknown threat might reasonably do. He sends gifts. He sends emissaries. He tries, simultaneously, to appease these newcomers and to gather intelligence on them. How many they are, what their weapons can really do, whether they bleed and tire and die like anyone else. He also sends a clear message, multiple times, that the Spanish are not welcome to travel further inland. Cortés ignores every single one of these messages and keeps marching toward Tenochtitlan anyway. The welcome. On November 8, 1519, after a journey that took them through hostile territory, multiple skirmishes, and an ever-shifting alliance network, Cortés and his men, along with roughly 1,000 Tlaxcalan warriors, are allowed to walk straight into the heart of Tenochtitlan. Unopposed, Montezuma personally welcomes them, with extraordinary ceremony and hospitality, into the very center of his own empire. This is, with the full benefit of 5 centuries of hindsight, almost certainly the single most consequential decision Montezuma makes in this entire story, and historians still don't fully agree on why he made it. Some argue it really was religious deference. Others argue it was a calculated diplomatic gamble. Better to bring a small, strange, and possibly useful foreign force inside your walls where you can watch them, control their movements, and study them up close, than to let them roam the countryside stirring up your already restless tributary states. If that was the plan, it was about to backfire in the worst possible way. Cortés and his men are housed in a palace compound within the city. For a while, the arrangement looks almost civilized, gifts are exchanged, the Spaniards are given a guided tour of a capital that leaves them stunned, and Montezuma continues to rule, at least nominally, exactly as he did before. But Cortés did not travel across an ocean and march through hostile territory to be a houseguest. The hostage. Within days of settling into Tenochtitlan, Cortés, citing alleged treachery on the part of his hosts, a claim that's never been fully substantiated, takes the extraordinary step of seizing Montezuma and holding him hostage, inside Montezuma's own palace, in the middle of Montezuma's own capital city, surrounded by Montezuma's own army. It is one of the boldest, most reckless gambles in the entire history of conquest. Cortés has, at most, a few hundred Spanish soldiers. He is sitting in the center of a city of 200,000 people, in an empire of millions, that could crush his entire expedition in an afternoon if it moved against him with full force. And yet it works. For now. Montezuma, whether out of genuine belief that resistance would bring disaster, or out of cold calculation that keeping the peace was still his best option, cooperates. He continues to appear before his people, continues to issue instructions, continues to project the image of a ruler who has simply chosen, for his own mysterious reasons, to host these strangers a while longer. His own nobles are not fooled. Bernal Díaz del Castillo, one of the Spanish soldiers who was actually there and later wrote a detailed first-hand account, describes a dignified man trying desperately to manage an impossible situation. A king attempting to convince his own kingdom that everything is fine, while functioning in every practical sense as a prisoner in his own home. Word spreads. Respect erodes. The empire that depended entirely on the unshakable image of Aztec military and political supremacy now has visible, undeniable proof that supremacy can be broken. The same tributary states that resented Tenochtitlan all along start watching very, very closely. The massacre at the temple. In the spring of 1520, Cortés is forced to leave Tenochtitlan personally, after learning that a rival Spanish force, sent from Cuba specifically to arrest him for disobeying orders, has landed on the coast. He leaves the city and Montezuma, in the hands of his subordinate, a particularly aggressive officer named Pedro de Alvarado, along with a garrison of roughly 80 Spaniards and a few hundred Tlaxcalan allies. This turns out to be a catastrophic decision. While Cortés is away defeating and then absorbing the rival Spanish force, convincing them, essentially, to switch sides and join his expedition rather than arrest him, Alvarado is left in Tenochtitlan, increasingly paranoid about an uprising he's convinced is imminent. During a religious festival, with Aztec nobles, priests and warriors gathered unarmed for a sacred ceremony in the city's main temple precinct, Alvarado makes a decision that will define the rest of the story. He orders his men to attack. Hundreds of unarmed Aztec nobles and priests are slaughtered in what becomes known as the massacre at the Great Temple. Whatever fragile, performative peace had existed in Tenochtitlan up to this point ends in that single afternoon. The city, predictably and justifiably, erupts. The city turns. Cortés, hearing of the disaster, rushes his expanded force back to Tenochtitlan and manages to fight his way back into the city. But the welcome he receives this time is nothing like the one he got in November. The garrison is under active siege when he arrives. The population, now unified in fury rather than divided by uncertainty, has turned decisively against the Spanish, and against Montezuma, who is now seen by many of his own people not as a captive making the best of an impossible situation, but as a collaborator who let this happen. Cortés, in increasing desperation, makes one final attempt to use Montezuma as he had used him for months, as a tool to calm the population. He orders the emperor to appear before his own people, from a terrace overlooking the plaza, and tell them to stop fighting. What happens next might be the most quietly devastating moment in the entire story. Montezuma, the absolute ruler of an empire of millions, the man whose word had once been treated as something close to divine law, steps out to address his people one final time. They jeer at him. They throw stones. They throw darts. The sources disagree, predictably, on exactly who delivers the fatal blow in the chaos that follows. Spanish accounts blame the Aztec crowd. Aztec accounts, recorded later, blame the Spanish themselves, suggesting Cortés's men killed Montezuma once he had become more liability than asset. Either way, sometime around June 29, 1520, Montezuma dies, not in battle, not with dignity, but stoned and abandoned by the very people he had spent his entire reign ruling, while functioning as a hostage of the very people he had once welcomed as guests. He had been betrayed, in the end, by almost everyone who mattered, by the strangers he hosted, by his own uncertainty, and finally, in his last public moment alive, by the rage of his own subjects, who no longer saw a ruler worth saving. La noche triste. With Montezuma dead and the city now led by his brother, Cuitlahuac, the Spanish position in Tenochtitlan becomes completely untenable. On the night of July 1, 1520, Cortés makes the decision to evacuate. His men construct a makeshift portable bridge to cross the gaps in the city's causeways. Gaps the Aztecs have deliberately opened to trap them, and attempt to slip out of the city under cover of a rainstorm, moving west toward the Tlacopan Causeway. For a brief window it almost works. Then a woman drawing water spots them. The alarm spreads through the sleeping city with terrifying speed, picked up by temple priests, then by the city's elite eagle warriors, then by what feels like the entire population at once. What follows is chaos on a scale the Spanish expedition has never experienced. Canoes swarm the causeway from both sides. Warriors attack from the water and from the causeway itself with swords, spears, and slings. Cortés had ordered his men to take whatever treasure they could carry on the way out, and that decision turns out to be lethal for many of them, as soldiers weighed down with stolen gold lose their footing, fall into the canals and drown, dragged under by the very wealth they'd refused to leave behind. Casualty estimates vary wildly depending on the source. Anywhere from a few hundred to well over 1,000 Spanish dead, with Tlaxcalan losses numbering well into the thousands as well. Whatever the precise number, it is a catastrophic, humiliating defeat. The Spanish call it, with grim simplicity, La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows. Cortés and his surviving men flee to Tlaxcala, their original allies, to regroup, lick their wounds, and plan what comes next. It will take them the better part of a year, but they will come back. The fall of Tenochtitlan. The Aztec victory at La Noche Triste turns out to be the empire's last great triumph, and a uniquely cruel one in hindsight, because the seeds of total destruction had already arrived with the Spanish, completely invisible to anyone on either side of the fighting. Smallpox, a disease completely unknown in the Americas before European contact tears through the population of Tenochtitlan with horrifying speed in the months after the Spanish retreat, killing enormous numbers of people, including Montezuma's own successor, Cuitlahuac, who dies of the disease after ruling for only a matter of months. Cortés, meanwhile, spends that same year rebuilding. He gathers more Tlaxcalan allies, secures fresh Spanish reinforcements and supplies, and, in one of the more remarkable engineering feats of the entire conquest, has a fleet of small ships called brigantines, built piece by piece and then hauled overland to be assembled on the shores of Lake Texcoco itself, giving him naval control of the very lake that had once made Tenochtitlan nearly unassailable. In May of 1521, the siege begins in earnest. Cortés systematically isolates the city, cutting off its causeways, its fresh water, and its food supply, while his brigantines control the lake itself. For nearly 3 months, the people of Tenochtitlan, already devastated by disease, already leaderless in any sense that matters, now led by Montezuma's young nephew, Cuauhtémoc, endure starvation, disease, and relentless assault. On August 13, 1521, the city finally falls. Cuauhtémoc is captured. The empire that Montezuma had inherited at its absolute peak less than 2 decades earlier ceases to exist. The betrayals. Counted. It's worth, at the end of this, actually counting the betrayals because there are more of them than most retellings have room for. He was betrayed by the very prophecy his own religion gave him. A belief system that may have made a foreign threat feel less like an enemy to repel and more like a destiny to manage. He was betrayed by his own empire's success. The tribute system that made the Aztecs rich and powerful also built an entire network of resentful subject peoples, the Tlaxcalans chief among them, who were simply waiting for anyone, to help them settle the score. He was betrayed by the strangers he personally welcomed into his own capital with gifts and ceremony, who repaid that hospitality by taking him hostage in his own home within days. He was betrayed by his own subordinate commander left in charge of the city during the crisis, though to be fair to Montezuma, that particular betrayal, Alvarado's massacre, wasn't his to prevent. It was committed against his own people by men who were already controlling him. And in the cruelest turn of all, he was betrayed in his final public moment alive by his own people, the population he had ruled his entire adult life, who looked at their emperor standing on a terrace asking for peace and saw not their ruler, but a man who had failed them and answered him with stones. Montezuma did not lose his empire because he was weak or cowardly or stupid, despite 5 centuries of historical writing. Most of it produced by the people who benefited from telling the story that way, that has often suggested exactly that. He lost it because he was the ruler of an empire built on a foundation that had cracks running through it long before a single Spaniard ever set foot on its shores, and because the specific, narrow set of choices available to him in 1519 and 1520 had no version that ended well. Some empires fall to superior armies. The Aztec Empire fell to something stranger and more devastating. A small foreign force that understood, faster and more ruthlessly than Montezuma ever could, exactly how many people inside his own empire were quietly hoping to see it burn.